Hi everybody, welcome back. We're still in Unit 2. We're now on Topic 4. We're looking at peacemaking, peacekeeping, and peace building, which are different things but often get conflated into the same sort of effort of the United Nations into achieving peace. From the outside, peacekeeping is arguably the most visible activity that the UN does. In other words, they go in and they try and help maintain a peace somewhere where it's been established. But because people don't understand the difference in the different kinds of activities and the different responsibilities that different parts of the United Nations have in relation to peace, these things all get conflated. And it's an important distinction to draw as to what is going on with what part of the UN, where, and when. So we're going to look at these three topics and try and figure out these things so that you at least will be able to keep them separate going forward. So let's start here with a slide called From the UN Charter, which I'm going to do several times in the next few lectures to get a sense of where the power, authority, responsibility comes from to do what's being done. The UN Charter has this to say about the maintenance of international peace and security, and I'm not going to read this, but the key concept here is this idea about taking effective collective measures. Now, the debate is whether there's anything in the Charter that lets the UN do peacekeeping activities, in other words, deploying troops to try and keep a peace that's already been reached. Because if you look through the part about the Security Council and their powers and authorities, aside from this general statement of maintaining international peace and security, it doesn't indicate anything short of going in with a force to stop an international conflict, a conflict between two competing sides. And early on in the UN's history, the majority of their actions abroad were to interject its UN forces between two competing sides. In other words, they're working on traditional security activities. So if you think back to that conversation we had about traditional, non-traditional, and human security concerns, these were two sides. They didn't want to fight anymore. They needed help not fighting, so in they went. But the majority of their activities in the modern era tend to be more either non-traditional or human security issues. Still need to keep the peace, but do different kinds of activities. But they draw the authority from here, and they'll pass their resolutions either under chapters 5, 6, or 7. The difference being, if it's passed under 7, that's where the binding language in the Charter lies, and if the UN Security Council enacts a mission under Chapter 7, then all the member states are bound to support it. So keep that in mind, that there's nothing specifically about the activities that we're going to look into, but there are important contributions to be made to international peace and security, and therefore the authority is drawn from there. There are key differences in these concepts, and this should be obvious when you look at them and think of them this way. But the only place where folks focus usually is on the peacekeepers. So you have to make a peace, then you keep a peace, and you build upon that peace. Not necessarily in this order or exclusively, but there are different kinds of activities calling into action different parts of the UN structure. Okay, so if we go here first to peacemaking, there is an office in the UN called the Office of Diplomacy, Prevention, and Action. So the main role played by the UN here is through the Secretariat. The Secretariat is that peculiar agencies we looked at in Unit 1, that one of the characteristics they're supposed to possess is that they are non-national, that when you become part of the Secretariat, you essentially surrender your nationality, which is interesting because even if you look at bios there, they'll say it's a Nigerian diplomat, or she was a Fijian economist or whatever, but they're supposed to not act as if they're from that nation. But because they have that reputation, and it's a well-earned reputation, they are trusted in a peacemaking role. That the two sides will not see the UN as biased for or against them, which means the UN can provide something called good offices. And because they have this good office, they're trusted. They can come in and negotiate with sides so that there won't be a bias one or the other. This is a picture on the right of India and Pakistan, one of their many border crossings. This is a relationship that's quite fraught with tension, and the UN repeatedly offers its peacemaking services in the guise of their good offices to them. There are a few other places that might play a good office's role in different places, but typically those are very specific examples. Maybe they're two Catholic countries and that are in a conflict, and they'll trust the Vatican to provide good offices. But the UN and the Secretariat is the main place to do this. Once a peace is made, and that doesn't mean it's a permanent peace, it just means they're no longer actively fighting, then there's perhaps a role for peacekeepers. Peacekeepers very much stick to this task. Their job is to keep a peace that's already been established. They're not a place that goes in and forces peace. And we go back up here, the diplomacy, prevention, and action. The action is not invasion. The action is proactive involvement to get to peace. A ceasefire, an agreement, a settlement, some sort of thing that will keep sides from going to war. And if those two sides feel that they need help ensuring that they have a peace, in other words, maybe they reached, as India and Pakistan did, an agreement to stop fighting in the Kashmir region, they need help to continue not fighting because they don't trust each other to not, or people within their sides to not restart war or to start a war, then you need peacekeepers. And so the UN's job in this context is to organize a force, to borrow troops from member states, because the UN does not have troops of its own, and to go in and keep a peace. Now, this is a very peculiar activity. I keep saying peculiar, but I think it's because there's a lot of very strange, unique things that go in here. The peacekeeping role that the United Nations plays almost entirely is without the authorization to use force. So they will be, for example, between two sides that were at war, whether that's a domestic confrontation or an international confrontation, and they will sit there or stand there or patrol there between the two sides to try and help them not fight. Their job is to keep that peace at the invitation of the formerly combating sides. And as long as they can do that, as long as they can operate and walk around and sort of be this neutral presence, then a peace might be able to be kept. It does mean that there are places where there have been peacekeepers since 1948. From 56, from 64, from 72, where the peacekeepers are still at, which some people look at from the outside and say, that's a failure. They didn't ever make peace there. Well, they did. They made a peace in the preliminary stages. They got a ceasefire, and they're there helping keep a peace. What they haven't yet done is build on the peace through the sides that are there to ensure a lasting peace. And that's why the peacekeepers need to stay there. Now, that doesn't mean that you shouldn't ever close down missions, but the goal is to transition these states from a state of former conflict to a permanent peace where you no longer need peacekeepers. But the fact that there are still peacekeepers present some places does not necessarily indicate a failure on behalf of the United Nations. If the sides still have not jumped past their enmity or their conflict, they may still need peacekeepers even decades after they were first deployed. So once they're deployed, then you can begin in conjunction with that or separate from that peacekeeping force, a peace-building activity. So they have several UN peace-building branches. There's a peace-building commission. There's an office on peace building with best practices, where they're trying to get folks past the initial concern. Now, in traditional conflict, these concerns were territorial expansionism. These concerns were cross-border ethnic or economic or political conflict, and they were frankly easier to work on than the systemic issues that may plague a country that had a civil war, where you're trying to get, for example, persecuted groups to feel confident in the society, where you're trying to build institutions so that the community and the locality and then the nation can have sustainable peace. So that may be something like this picture here, which is elections monitoring and helping institute that sort of representational democracy, which is part of the commitment that they make in these situations. But a lot of it may be training through respect measures, trying to humanize the other, where one ethnic group was aligned against another ethnic group, trying to get them to have trust in each other. You may be trying to rebuild a police force. You may be trying to institute an effective communication system. You may be trying to rebuild an education system that doesn't have elements of hate embedded in its textbooks, etc. So it's a complex, complicated process that is called peace building, and this is not a quick one, so it may take a long, long time. But in all three of these cases, one of the key overarching principles remains the concept from the Charter that we've revisited several times, which is domestic jurisdiction. The only part of the charter that permits the UN to have a force that is put upon a country is if they need to send in an attack force, an invasion force, which has happened very infrequently, where the UN has essentially created an army and gone and invaded like they did in Korea, like they authorized in the first Gulf War. Otherwise, all the peace-related activities are at the invitation of the domestic jurisdiction in consideration. So that could be multiples if it's a trans-boundary conflict, or it could be domestic only if it's a domestic priority. So South Sudan needed peacekeepers when it became independent to help it maintain a peace with Sudan. But after a few years, the bigger problem became South Sudanese conflict. So then you needed permission just from the South Sudanese to work on rebuilding after the Civil War. And that's what the peace building concept is for. So do think of this as distinct but related. You make a peace, you keep a peace, you build on a peace. And the place you see the soldiers, the UN, what's called the blue helmets, is in the keeping phase. When there's a peace to keep, this becomes complicated additionally because if warfare breaks out in the midst of a peacekeeping situation, then there is no longer a peace to keep, and the role of the UN typically is to withdraw because it's not an invasion force, it's not a third army, it's not equipped to fight battles against two or more or one or more combative sides. Except in rare instances, they just aren't equipped to do so. You build a mission to keep the peace, which requires certain kinds of troops, certain kinds of armament, certain kinds of capabilities that are different from an active warfare scenario. So that the force is not ready if it comes to a position where you need to what's called enforce a peace. So this is really rare. It's a new direction that's being tried out at the behest of an individual nation with their domestic jurisdiction. So this is a photo from the Democratic Republic of the Congo. And if you look at these things, these are tanks. Tanks are offensive weapons. They can be defensive in the sense that you can discourage sides from being belligerent. But in this case, the rebel groups are so entrenched and intransigent and won't come to the negotiating table that Congo has asked the UN to have offensive capabilities, to attack, to enforce peace in certain regions of the country. I don't anticipate that this will be a direction that expands radically because there's not a lot of people in the world who want the UN to have its own military capability. So each time you do this, you have to build the mission that would involve the right kinds of troops, the right kinds of material, the right kinds of equipment to fight an offensive war. But there is this new direction that's out there that casts the UN not as a neutral force, in other words, sitting between two sides who equally view the UN as having good offices, whether that's their diplomats or their soldiers, but who want the UN to kick ass and take names. So what does this all mean for us? Well, it's complex and complicated like a lot of other things. So peacekeeping, peacemaking, peace building, different concepts, related concepts. When it comes to time to peacekeep, one of the challenges the UN has is, first, it's by permission of the sides. Second, they don't have soldiers in the first place, so they have to go out and borrow them. They go country to country and say, will you give us troops? Will you give us weapons? Will you give us trucks? Do you have a doctor? Do you have a general? And you have to build a mission from scratch, which means they're not really ready to rapidly deploy if the situation demands it. It takes time to build a peacekeeping mission, and sometimes the horrors of conflict and war spread so fast that the UN can't respond quickly enough. For example, the entire Rwandan genocide, which you may have heard of, that was in 1994, it was over in 6 weeks. So if you have to go borrow soldiers to build a force, you're not going to be able to get in the next day or the next week to begin to act and interact. You have to spend time. The UN, in that case, an individual nation is much more able to deploy its own sources, its own forces to react than the UN is, which is constrained on purpose by some of the rules that were put in place by the Charter and by the Security Council. Very well-known activities, very important activities. They're related to the maintenance of international peace and security.